Hi, and welcome to the Brookdale Visiting Writers Series show. My name is Suzanne Parker, and I'm part of the faculty here at Brookdale, where I co-direct the creative writing program. Today, I'm very excited to have Dean Young on our show. Dean Young is the author of 9 books of poetry, including his most recent book, which is called The Foggist, as well as, published in 2008, Primitive Mentor, and in 2005, Elegy on Toy Piano, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. He has received fellowships from the National Endowment of the Arts and a Guggenheim Foundation, and his awards include an Academy Award in Literature from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and he has taught at the Iowa Writers Workshop and the Low Residency Program at Warren Wilson College and at Loyola University in Chicago. And he's currently the William Livingston Chair of Poetry at the University of Texas in Austin. And we are very excited, Dean, to have you on the show, so welcome.
Thank you.
I wanted to start talking about your work by asking about your work in general. There has been so much writing about Dean Young's work. Your work has been analyzed and discussed. There's been essays about it. I know in APR last year, the American Poetry Review, Tony Hoagland even wrote an essay called The Dean Young Effect. And I thought, with all these people describing your work for you, I'd love to actually start off just asking how you would describe your work.
Well, I don't generally read what people write about.
Write about you.
Well, they're not writing about me. They're writing about Dean Young, that person who's written those books, and that's not me. And also, I figure they're not writing it for me. It's like I don't read reviews either. I don't need to read a review of my own book. I wrote the darn thing. But describing my own work is a bit like trying to describe what you look like with your nose pressed against the mirror. It's going to be out of focus. It's going to be strange, somewhat monstrous, because all that I care about my work presently is in ways that I'm in it. I think it's really, really important to actually, a vital ingredient of writing, a necessity for my imagination, is to not know what I'm doing. Now, I'm sure there are general characteristics that I continue to exhibit ruts, perhaps, but I'm not really conscious of it. I know that there are particular kind of influences on my work that are very pronounced, particularly New York School, French Surrealism, and maybe some that aren't as pronounced. I hope I'm influenced by Keats. I hope I'm influenced by Hopkins, but I want to answer the question. I seem not to be. One of the things I think I do in my work...
Would it help if I put it in third person? Like, how would Dean Young describe a Dean Young poem?
That's like 2 people I don't know. I think one of the things that I like to do is cultivate various kinds of instabilities, and bring things in contact, modes of creating poetry, modes of lyricism with kinds of content that don't seem to match up. One of the things, poetry has always been involved in the creation of and the maintenance of the sacred, but it's also very much been involved in transgression and violation of the sacred. And a lot of the enactments of sacred, a lot of the representations have to do with keeping things apart. You do this, but you don't do that. The Egyptians were really good at mummifying bodies. But they were lousy at food preservation, and a lot of those processes that they used on the mummification of bodies, they could have used on food preservation, but you don't treat your food like you treat a body. So that's a basic separation. And what I think I'm interested in poetry is violating those kinds of separations. Often things seem to be funny that shouldn't be funny. Humor in particular is often a manifestation of some transgression being made. Either it's a transgression that's flat out radiantly silly and goofy, or it's a transgression where someone says something that's true in a context you wouldn't expect them to say something true, unless children are very good at that. They'll walk into a room and say, "He has big ears," and that's the truth, but you're not accustomed to that truth being that I'm interested in.
Well, there's so much in that answer, actually, that I want to follow up and ask more questions about.
Good, we could be finished for the day.
Well, first, you talked about your work is often mentioned in the same breath as surrealism as well. And the sense of, when I looked at your work, I've always kind of thought about the sense of play and imaginative freedom in surrealism to a certain extent. Has this been an influence on your work?
I hope so. Breton talks about the poem being a debacle of the intellect. And first of all, there has to be an intellect there to debacle. So one of I try to make the poems as aware as possible, and at the same time have them have a kind of unconscious movement to them. So that another way of sort of the little hamster wheel I run on when I write a poem is I sit down and I write some things which come from nowhere, or I write something that's in my mind. If it's in my mind, I try to see what nowhere I can make it go to somewhere else. And if it starts from nowhere, I try to find something there. And I think that one of the surrealist ethos was to put the imagination in the center of our being and in the center of our life. And the notion that the imaginary only produces the imagination only produces the imaginary is actually quite false. The imagination plays a very important role in the creation of the real. Apollinaire, in his essay, the Poets in the New Age, talks about how initially we thought Icarus was just a supposed truth, an imagining, but of course it became real. And the acts of the imagination are always sort of in front of truth. They're clairvoyant, they're predictive in a way. And of course they play a steady part, important part in our emotional lives. To love somebody is an act of imagination. It's not an it's
Some
not
would say
an
even more so sometimes.
Yes, in particular cases, a huge act of the imagination, I'm afraid.
You mentioned the New York School as well. And when you started writing, who were your poetic heroes?
Frank O'Hara, Kenneth Koch, and John Ashbery.
Why?
Really.
What was it about them?
They were able to write poetry that had a particular kind of insouciance about it that didn't seem to be so bloody serious. And also, I mean, my earliest influence, I started writing poetry when I was in the 3rd grade, and I just didn't stop. I mean, I should be a lot better than I am now, but
but you're awfully good.
Yeah, I don't know about that. So initially, I was very interested in the play of language. One fish, two fish, red fish, blue fish. I still periodically teach that book in graduate seminars because it's about how singing can create the world. But
do you think of your poems as songs?
I try to.
Yeah.
It's it's the limit. It's that wobbling between one outer limit is song and the other outer limit is the delivery of information. So one of the things I try to do is to dart back and forth between those two positions. Anyway, the New York School. Well, then when I went to college, I continued writing. But when I really started to think about it and started to read poetry seriously, their poetry had a sort of sophistication, but at the same time lightness to it. It wasn't claiming its authority based upon misery. And based upon the notion that here's my poem, it took me 150 years to write. Well, that must mean it's good. That's not necessarily true at all. So there was something liberating about it, and the sort of studied foolishness in the work. And what I've grown to realize about Ashbery in particular as the years go by is that his work is like a historical compendium of manners and sounds of English poetry. You can hear the 17th century in his poems. You can hear the 18th century in his poems all the time. He's an extraordinary master of that. So the poems aren't necessarily sort of predicated on, here's a poem called Raccoon, and the whole poem is about a raccoon. There's a certain amount of imaginative liberty in the poems that something is going to happen while you're reading the poem. Are
they still your biggest influences at this point? I mean, are these still the people you turn to?
Yeah, I read a lot. A lot of my reading has to do with what I'm teaching. So
And
often
you teach at University of Texas.
right, right,
And you
you
teach
know,
grad
at
classes?
least once a year, I teach a seminar. It's for writers, but you know, we have a reading list, and you know, I feel obligated that my reading list has to have some sort of connection to you know, not just poetry of the 20th century, which is even the past now. So you know, to develop a kind of historical sense, and it's just also interesting. So I try to be as influenced as I can by everything. But there are those poets who are very, very comforting to me. Ashbery, Coke, O'Hara, Tamaj Solomon is somebody who I just read. He's like B12 to me. It just sort of reminds me of you know, a particular kind of intensity that feels like, you know, it's the party, it's the table at the big party of poetry that I hope I can sit at.
When you first started writing when you were in third grade, you said, but when you were exposed to these poets and you really started to take them in, were you trying to mimic them in your own writing at all?
Oh, of course, mimicry I think is really important. In fact, you know, I don't put much stock in originality. I just try to copy as faithfully as possible. And the truth of the matter is, I'm terrible at copying. You know, if originality exists, it's the same way originality exists in us as species. It starts out as mistakes. You know, evolution is basically one mistake after another, and some of them work, and that's the great thing about poetry. You get to throw a lot away.
At this point, there sort of is. I mean, like Tony Hoagland's essay said, the Dean Young effect. I mean, we're talking about your influences and who influenced you. I mean, you have influenced an upcoming generation of poets. Do you ever think about that, or feel the weighty obligation of it in some way?
You know, Tony's my best friend, and we've talked about that a little bit. And the things he attributes, the positive things he attributes to my work, the particular kind of I don't know what you call them, artistic characteristics, aren't by any means original to my work. So you know, if I felt that was true, I would say, well, that's fine. These younger poets are just going to read more, and you know, they're gonna go back and read Keats and say, oh, that's where Young stole that. And they're going to read Gilgamesh and say, damn, it's the same thing. And that's my whole point about originality. I don't feel like I'm original at all. You know, I'm a compendium of mistaked ape manners and echoes.
Well, that is actually, we have to take a break, so that's a really good soundbite to go out on. I'm talking with Dean Young today on the Brickdale Visiting Writers Series show. Please join us again after the break.
Family and friends can provide the support you need to reduce your risk of cancer, diabetes, heart disease, and stroke. Eat right and get active.
Hi, and welcome back to the Brickdale Visiting Writers Series show. My name's Suzanne Parker, and I'm here today interviewing the poet Dean Young, whose most recent book is called The Foggist, and is a chapbook out from Holly Ridge Press. I have that right? Yeah? All right, great. Before we took a break, you touched a little bit on your actual writing process. And for people who don't know your work, one of the wonderful things I find about your poems is they're just so loose. You know, they go from idea to idea to idea. They have these wonderful breaks. You know, they're humorous. They're deeply touching at the same time. And as a reader of the poem, I'm never really sure when I start where I'm going to end up. I was talking to somebody, telling them it was sort of like the way I ski. I'm like always on the border of being sort of out of control and wiping out, but it's exhilarating. It's like, it's a great ride, your poems. And as a poet myself, I've always really admired like the craft that goes into them. And I wonder what your process is when you sit down to write a poem. You know, how do they come out in many drafts? Do you do one in a whole sitting?
It's always different. I usually start with nothing, or just some stuff some words or something. And then I just try, Breton has this phrase, to blacken a page with a praiseworthy disdain of literature. So I try to write lines, I try to write sentences. It's like I try to get the poem to start looking back at me.
Now, what do you mean by that?
That there's something there, that I didn't put it there. Of course I did, but it's like you put certain chemicals together and nothing happens, but you put other chemicals together and they explode, or they create something.
So you want the poem to take on its own life.
Yeah, and I want to feel that kind of momentum as I rewrite it and rewrite it and rewrite it and change things and put things in and take things out and move stuff around and bring in other things. And sometimes that can, if I have enough time and if I'm energetic enough or whatever the strange thing is, that can happen pretty much in a single day. I write a lot. I probably write too much. I try to write every day. I don't know how you can write too much, but and I pretty much approach the poem with an utterly blank mind, and to see what'll happen. I'm trying to see something, look back at me, which has to do with presence, I think, in the poem, which has to do with something about it being expressive of the human dilemma in some way, it having some kind of emotional content, but the human dilemma can also primarily be an artistic one. But I'm also trying to hear something. I'm trying to hear some kind of music, and that's an imperative in the poem, as well as shifting rhetorical levels of different kind of discourse in the poem. And I'm also trying to find the end. Ends are extremely, extremely important to me. Poetry is all about endings. Its primary characteristic is a line, and the line defines itself by coming to an end. It ends all the time, and that's one of the things I like about it. So I'm trying to get to some point where the poem ends, and it's going to be almost always somewhere else. But that's the thing that interests me.
You revise a lot, it sounds
all the
like.
time.
The poems, and again, they take great leaps. I mean, these wonderful imaginative leaps, but they always seem very controlled to me. Like I feel like I'm in very sure hands. And I wonder when you're revising, I guess, how much moving around you do or all the rest of it, because the logic of the poem, the way the poem's flowing, seems kind of locked down. And I'm wondering how much shifting around went actually into it before, I'm seeing the poem in Primitive Mentor.
Sometimes quite a lot.
Really?
Because there is a kind of through line that I am trying to get, because, poems are about coming to an end, which means they're about the passage of time. So how do we know that time passes? Is because things have changed. So I want to have some kind of, connectivity, some kind of, sometimes there's a trace of a narrative, sometimes there's a biographical trace, sometimes there's a sense of this speaker who is almost a character and says these things.
Sure.
So also, the possibilities of a kind of purposefulness, all these things may or may not come into play. But it does remain mysterious to me. It's interesting to hear you say about, how controlled it seems, because control is not particularly one of my values. Because it seems to be relatively neutral, because it only matters what you're controlling if the control is any interest in it at all.
But it's in the through line. Like you have these, really big leaps, unexpected, the surprise in your poems. But I guess it is this through line, this central thing that to me is the control factor. It's like, I'm jumping to this, and you never expected me to go there, but it's gonna work because I'm going to bring you back here.
And that's the thing that sometimes has to be imposed in the poem.
Oh, really?
Because my main people have different kinds of propensities in their sensibilities. Some people, my sensibility is very, very dispersive. As far as tonal variance, I have that for breakfast. That's when I look at the world is full of constant tonal variance. So I don't have to try to achieve that. But the downside of that is if you're trying to create something that has a form, it's just everything's flying apart. So I have to sort of lean in the other direction.
Gotcha. Yeah.
To get some, and sometimes I just have to impose it. It's like going into the poem with a nail gun, and you put these nails in places, then you shake it, and stuff falls away, and there it is.
That's a great image. And you answered actually another question I had, because you do have all these different, registers of diction and tonal shifts in the poem. And so you were saying you sort of think in that way.
Yeah.
I mean, is that something you try to? I need a pop culture reference here. Let me work that in.
Well, I just try to bring in as much variance as possible. For me, the idea is not to sort of. I'm more like, I want the poem to sort of light up the entire brain instead of just sort of light up a single pinpoint of it. I'm not a drill bit writer. Pound talks about that rock and drill bit and all that. That's not the kind of writer I am. I'm in the big mess.
Have you ever been?
I've never been anything but what I am, regrettably.
No, regrettably. You've gone deeper.
I have some poems. I wrote some odes, and I go back to them periodically, and it occurred to me like a revelation that a poem can actually have a subject. That you can write a poem, like Ode to a Hangover, and it's about a hangover the whole way through. That seemed just like an extraordinary revelation to me when I discovered that. Yeah.
Actually, I wanted to talk about as well. You teach, and you've taught for a number of many years.
Yeah.
And Charles Baxter has this wonderful, relatively new series called The Art of, and it's poets and writers talking about craft in some element. And actually, I have this wonderful quote you gave from one of your poems called "Leaves in Dead Swimming Pool," where you wrote about theories about art aren't art any more than a description of an aphid is an aphid. And this seems a great definition of poetics, but you're the next book coming out of this poetry series, correct?
Yeah.
So I wonder what got you into that.
And that poem is in that book. I just put it right in there so you can't tell that it's in there.
How did you come up to writing the book?
Well, Charlie asked me to, and originally they asked me to write a book about surrealism. I said I couldn't sustain it, and I had already done so much study on surrealism that I was kind of sick of that. But over the years, I had for when I teach seminars, I often write out little lectures, little 10, 20-minute lectures. And when I was teaching at Warren Wilson, you would have to give lectures, and when I go other places, they'd ask me to give craft talks. So I had a pile of prose about that high.
Wow. Going back how far? 10, 20 years?
Yeah, pretty much 20 years. And so what I did is I just sat down and I wrote a beginning. And then I started just trying to put together, not an argument, but something that felt to have some kind of connection to me. And at least to move from thing to thing and to be lively and maybe provocative and to say some of the things I've been saying over and over again through the years to my writing students and stuff, and hopefully that'll help me say something else later.
Looking at 20 years worth, did you notice that things had changed? Your thinking had changed?
Yeah, of course it changed, but it was still I think it was still the same. I think I'm still on the same kind of inquiry.
It's deepened.
Yeah, well, it's also you just have to move on to different things. And one of the things that happens is I think the older you get, the closer the past gets. So 100 years doesn't seem that far away to me anymore. The poetry of the 18th century isn't completely unapproachable to me anymore. So I think it shows a little bit a historical sense, to use Eliot's phrase, a very cracked one, of course. There's an analysis of Hamlet in there as a knock-knock joke. I mean, the play begins, who's there?
That's true.
And all the play is Hamlet saying to himself, Hamlet who?
Until you want to shake him.
Yes, yeah.
I was interested in how you put a book together.
Of poems? I look at this file that I have of poems, and it's this big, and I say, shit, this is a mess. I need to neaten things up. And I usually have some sort of sense of what I feel is a good first poem, and what I feel is a last poem. And then I start sort of organizing things on various sorts of variance variance as an organizing principle. And then if I put sections in it, the reason I do that is because you get to have more than one first and last poem.
So it's a little cheat.
usually a book is about a third of the poems I've written in that period.
Because you've had a lot of books come out in the last.
I know.
Well, you're wonderfully prolific. We only have about 45 seconds or so more, but could you tell us about your new book that's coming out?
Yeah, I wish I could, but I've nearly forgotten it because I finished it quite some time ago now. And I've already got enough poems for another book easily, not counting the Faugus.
Which it came out. It's actually poems after Falling Up.
Yeah. I think there's a kind of somewhat serious romantic agony on display in that book.
Once again, you're leaving us with a great soundbite. A serious romantic agony. Dean, it has been a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you.
And folks, you've been listening to Dean Young, a wonderful poet, and this is the Brookdale Visiting Writer Series show. Please watch us again.